Hello, my friends. Happy Sunday. Hey, I am coming to you from my storybook stairs because, stories are just one of the most wonderful things. Some of my happiest memories with my kids is everybody cuddled up in bed reading a story, right? Well, today we've been talking about miracles, and today we're going to go over 5 of those stories that we talked about, all right? And the difference between these stories on these steps and even some of the stories we would read together, all cuddled up in bed with my family, the difference is these stories are true. They really happened, and the writers of these stories were right there with Jesus, walking hand in hand. Now, the things that we talked about, they seemed like they were out of this world, and they were only possible because it was Jesus in these stories, right? All right, so that's what I want you to remember. Now, these miracle stories, the other thing we talked about a lot is that they would show God's great power, right? Yep, but they were also, notice in them how they also served and loved people as well. All right, the things that Jesus did, the miracles he performed, not only showed the power of God and the power of Jesus as his son, but also they served and loved other people. So what was that first one? Do you guys remember? All right, I'll give you a clue. Had to do with water. And it was, that sounded cool, water. It was Jesus' first miracle, and he was at a wedding. Do you remember? What was the problem? That's right, they'd run out of wine. And I told you guys it was like if you were at a birthday party and they ran out of birthday cake. All right, it was not a little problem. It was a big problem. So here's my pitcher, and they had a big jug, right? And there was water. But all they had was cool, clear water. And what did the people want? What did the host want to serve? He wanted to serve wine. So Jesus went and blessed the big pitcher of water, and he took it over to the head of the wedding and said, okay, try this. And he poured it in, and not only was there water, but there was wine. It was a miracle. And it wasn't just any old wine. It was the best tasting wine. And the servant said, most people save they use the best first and then save, the kind of not so good wine for the end. But Jesus gave the best. He gave the best wine. Jesus, when his mom told him what she wanted him to do, she told him the problem, right? She didn't even have to say, go do this. She just said the problem. He said, it may not be my time. Remember, this may be your time. It may be time, even when you're young, for you to do big things for God. All right, that's what I want you to get out of that. Number 2 we talked about were the fishermen. Do you remember when Jesus went to the lake and he met the fishermen, and they had been fishing with their nets? It was a much bigger net than this. They'd been fishing with their nets over and over and over, and they were pulling out nothing. And they were talking to Jesus, and Jesus said, go out, throw down your nets. And what did they come back with? They came back with a net full of fish. It was so full to overflowing. The nets were actually tearing. It was so full of fish. And Jesus talked to them, and they knew they could only be done with Jesus. That was the only way they could throw their nets in. They were experienced fishermen. They knew how that body of water worked. They knew how the fish came, and they knew it had to be a miracle that Jesus had done that. And Jesus told them something very important that day. He said, I am going to make you fishers of what? That's right, fishers of men. I'm going to take you, men who believe in me and see my miracles and see the power of God in me, and I'm going to send you out, and I want you to tell people about me so that they could come in and I could love them. All right? That's what that miracle was about. All right, this next one was a biggie. Has to do with a big number. Do you guys remember counting on your hands? 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. And we had to get up to 1,000, 5,000. In church that day, if you happened to be there, I cut out 5,000 little pieces of confetti. All right? You guys might want to do that at home. So each one of these little pieces of confetti represented one person there. All right, and remember, there was probably more than 5,000 because there was women and children that often weren't counted. And so there they were up on the mountain. The crowds had followed Jesus, and he'd been teaching all day long. And the people, he started realizing, they didn't pack a lunch. You guys ever go on a picnic and pack a lunch when you go? Right. They didn't do that. They were just following Jesus wherever he went. And so they were up on that mountainside, and the people were getting hungry. And the disciples came to Jesus. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? Should we send them out to the villages? Should we send them all home? And Jesus said, you feed them. Could you imagine those disciples? Now, they'd seen other miracles, but still they were like, us, we don't have enough money to do that. We can't feed all these people, right? And Jesus said, you feed them. And he found a little boy with a basket, and it had 2 fish and 5 loaves, and he prayed over it. He talked to God. He prayed, asked his Father to help, right? And he broke those into little bits, and he put it in the baskets, and he gave it to the 12 disciples and said, you take it. And he fed. They kept feeding and kept feeding people. And the people in the back, they were probably wondering, will there be enough for me? Guess what? There was more than enough. And when they had fed everyone, not just a tiny bite, but all they could eat, they had fed everyone all they could eat, there were still 12 baskets of food left over. More than enough, more than they started with. More than enough. That's what Jesus is. He's more than enough for us. He's more than enough for you and for me, and he's going to meet your every need. All right, let's look on to the next one. Oh, this is a funny one. Are you ready? Not funny, but kind of fun. You got your feet ready? Here, let me see your feet. Get your feet up there. All right, this is the one we talked about, Peter, right? And the disciples were out on a boat, and Jesus had gone away to pray, and he sent them out. He's like, you go over there, I'll meet you. All of a sudden, the water's rocky. Make it rocky. Make it rocky. Yeah. And Jesus is coming toward them, and they're like, is that a ghost? Who could that be walking on the water? All right. And Peter, he looked out and he saw Jesus, and he was so focused on Jesus. All his thoughts, all his mind and his heart were all focused on Jesus. And he said, Jesus, just tell me to come. And he said, come, Peter. And Peter started walking on the water. What happened next? As soon as he stopped focusing on Jesus, he started looking this way, looking that way, seeing the waves, hearing the storm, feeling, wait, I'm on top of water. I should sink. Getting it all in his mind instead of his heart being poured out to Jesus. What happened? He started to sink. But when he reached out, Jesus held him up, and they walked on water, and they got to the boat. And when they got to the boat, the storm settled. The waves settled, and they calmly floated. They were so close to shore. All right, so you guys, what can we do if we really focus on Jesus? We have that path, right? We have that path that we know is just so focused on him. But when we go off this way, we go off that way, that's when our trouble starts. We need to stay with our whole heart and mind and strength all focused on Jesus. Now, I know some guys who did stay focused on Jesus. Do you guys remember this story? There was one man who was paralyzed, and he couldn't move, and he sat on his mat day and night. He would sit out there. His family had to dress him and feed him, and Jesus had been going from town to town to town, and he couldn't get up and run to Jesus, could he? But he had some friends, and these friends, they woke up that morning. They heard that Jesus was coming to their town, and what did? They ran. They ran to go find their friend. And they picked up the corners of his mat, and they carried him to where Jesus was. And when they got there, what happened? You guys remember? There was a very long line. And so they thought, we can't wait. We can't wait in this long line. We may never get to where Jesus is. And so they found the little house, and they went around to the back, and up they climbed the stairs. And when they got there, they thought, what can we do? And they started popping the top off. They started pulling those tiles off, and they tied the man's mat to ropes, and they lowered him in to see Jesus. What did Jesus think of that? Do you guys remember? He was so happy. He was so happy with the faithfulness of those men and the friendship that they showed, taking their paralyzed friend and not just going to get him, not just saying, hey, Jesus is here, but carrying him. Seeing the line, they carried him up to the top. They pulled off the tiles of the roof, and they lowered him down. And there Jesus was. And Jesus said, stand up, roll up your mat, and walk home. And that's what that man did. The man who for all those years could not even stand was able to get up, roll up his mat, and walk home. And you know the part of the story I really like is that the Pharisees were there, right? Do you guys remember the Pharisees? We're going to be talking more and more about them. But the Pharisees were there, and they said, this is the law, this is the rules, this is what we have to do. And they did not believe that Jesus was the Son of God. They did not believe that he could do what he said he could do. And they saw him. They saw him heal that man. Very likely they'd seen that man on his mat every day as they'd walk by. They knew who that man was. They knew that he could not walk before Jesus was there. And Jesus performed a miracle right there before their eyes. He wanted them to see. He wanted them to know that he was truly the Son of God. And finally, you guys, the story we talked about last week, it's one of my favorites because Jesus took some of his favorites. Do you remember who his 3 disciples were that he was the most close to? They were Peter, James, and John, right? And he took them and he said, let's go up to the mountain. And when he got to the top of the mountain, there, his face started shining as bright as the sun. And his clothes were like new fallen snow, so bright, right? They saw Jesus in his glory. And from the sky, from heaven, came down Moses and Elijah. Remember Moses from the Old Testament. He had passed away years and years and years ago. And here he was coming down from heaven to meet Jesus. And then a cloud came over. And it was glowing and it was full of light. And the voice of God spoke and said, this is my son, who I'm so well pleased. Listen to him. And that's what we all need to do. Finally, the cloud went away. Elijah and Moses went away, and there was Jesus standing with his 3 disciples. Remember the disciples, they had bowed down to worship. Right thing to do, right? And Jesus came over and he touched their shoulders, he touched their backs, and they looked up and they saw Jesus with a face of peace and light. Beautiful. Jesus was shining with all his glory, having the face of peace and light. Those disciples would never forget what they saw. They would never think that Jesus was only a man. They would know that he is the Son of God, the Son of God who shines with peace and light. And I hope you guys will remember that. I hope you remember as that we're telling these stories that they are true. They are so full of God's love for us. They're so full of the power of God shining through his Son, Jesus. And remember that Jesus is full of glory and full of peace and light. I love you guys, and I'll see you next week. Shine with the glory and the peace and light of Jesus. Shine.